Welcome to today's presentation on the latest report by Neil Lane and Norm Augustine. I'm Aline McNall, Senior Legislative Representative, and on behalf of the staff and all of the members of IEEE USA, I wanted to welcome and thank our speakers for joining us today. We look forward to their presentation.
Thank you, Elaine. I'm Brendan Godfrey, Vice President for Communications at IEEE USA. I want to thank everyone for joining us for this special IEEE USA live stream presentation, The Perils of Complacency, America at the Tipping Point in Science and Engineering, by its authors Norman Augustine and Neil Lane. Neil is the Senior Fellow in S&T Policy at the Baker Institute for Public Policy and Professor Emeritus of Physics and Astronomy at Rice University. Earlier, he served as Science Advisor to President Clinton and also as the Director of the Office of Scientific and Technology Policy, as NSF Director, as Rice University Provost, and in other positions. Norman Augustine is an IEEE Life Fellow, is retired Lockheed Martin Corporation Chairman and CEO. He also has served as the Undersecretary of the Army, was a co-author of the Rising Above the Gathering Storm seminal report, and once again, numerous other public service roles. Please remember that you can ask questions at any time by typing them in, and they will be answered after the presentation is over. Norm?
Well, thank you, Brendan, and thank those of you who are listening in to what we believe is a very important issue. It probably is a little incongruous to be talking about America being at a very hazardous tipping point in science and engineering at the very time that we're applauding and celebrating the accomplishments in science dealing with the COVID-19 threat. But the fact is that we are at a tipping point in science and engineering in this country. And I'd like to share with you on behalf of Neil, myself, and those we worked with, some of the reasons that we believe that's the case. Could I have the next chart? You could go to the next one. China and the United States have been on rather different trend curves in many regards. This is just one of them. It shows the number of graduates in science and engineering, baccalaureate level. In China, the red curve, and the United States, the blue curve. These are graduates from universities in those countries. And not surprisingly, China is graduating far more than we because China has a much larger population. But that's only part of the answer. The fact is that, we, as we look at a large number of parameters, measuring the relative performance and input to by the two countries, China is clearly moving ahead and crossing the U.S. In these various parameters. Next chart. For example, if you look at patents, so this is kind of a complicated curve, but a set of curves. The red line is patents in China, and the blue line is the United States. China, again, has passed us. Patents are, of course, not a precise measure, but they are just another indicator of the application of science. Next chart. The history of modernization is, in essence, a history of scientific and technological progress. Inventions have brought about new civilizations, modern industries, and the rise and fall of nations. I firmly believe that science is the ultimate revolution. Well, who said that? It was Wen Jiabao, the premier of the People's Republic of China. And that view is widely held by the leadership of China and has been. In fact, most of the leaders of China in recent years, until very recently, have been engineers. Next chart. Some years ago, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences sponsored a study called Restoring the Foundation that took a look at America's role in research in preserving the American dream. And the authors of that study, included Neil and myself, were very concerned that America was losing its edge in research and underinvesting in it. Because of that and the rapid rise of China in the last decade or so, and even more, we gathered the same group of people together. Next chart. Next chart. To update that study. We recently produced a book called The Perils of Complacency, which points to the fact that America is a tipping point in science and engineering, not a positive tipping point, and we are about to be overtaken by China, and our competitiveness in the world, whether it affects jobs or national security or education or what have you, is endangered. Next chart shows the people who worked on the study. There were 20 of us. Our findings were unanimous. Let me just say it includes former government presidential appointees. It includes university presidents, corporate CEOs, former members of Congress, Nobel laureates, kind of a broad group. And the amazing thing is it is unanimous. Next chart, please. This is sort of a report card. The United States is hanging on as first place in investment in R&D. This is total investment, government, private, at purchasing power parity, but China has jumped up from 17th to first place in the last few years. 17th to second place, and is about to become first place on the trend lines that we're now following. Bloomberg puts out an innovation ranking. The United States has fallen from first to eighth. R&D as a percent of GDP, a particularly important measure. We're now 10th. Primary and secondary education, we rank 25th. Professionals engaged in R&D per capita, 28th. Fraction of research funding by government, 29th. The initial degrees awarded in engineering were in 76th place, just slightly ahead of Mozambique. I should comment on the education. Let's go to the next chart. I want to comment on the education, which is that that finding is based on the PISA test given to 15-year-olds in a very large number of countries, where we rank 25th out of 31 developed countries. Let me turn now to this chart that you have on the screen, the number of companies in the global Fortune 500. The chart shows the United States is fairly flat or declining in blue, China rapidly ascending in red. In fact, China has crossed us just a year after the last bar on this particular chart, now exceeding our number of companies in the global Fortune 500. This is not a perfect chart in the sense it's based on where the companies are headquartered. And nonetheless, I think the trend should certainly be concerning. Let's now turn to the next chart, which Neil will address, that talks about the recommendations that our group has made.
Thank you very much, Norm. So in preparing this update report, we examined the earlier report and our recommendations in it. We concluded they're still valid, and we've included them as an appendix in the new report. The situation, in many ways, has not gotten any better. In fact, you could argue that it's worse. So we picked out some of those, and we've chosen to highlight them at the front end of our new report. And I'm going to briefly summarize those, very briefly, abbreviated, I would say. So if you're interested in the details, I hope you are, we encourage you to take a look at the report, which is online at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences website, and also at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy website. So first recommendation here is to increase investments in R&D. Grow federal basic research funding by at least 50%. From the current 0.2% of GDP to 0.3% of GDP. Do that as soon as possible. Grow federal applied research by the same amount. It's the next stage in the innovation process, and it should continue to grow. These two recommendations would actually boost federal research from about $80 billion, basic and applied research, from about $80 billion, which it is today in the last year, to about $120 billion. And you might consider this, Tim, we've considered it a modest recommendation, but a very important one. Given all that's going on, you could make compelling arguments for even bolder recommendations. We suggest that the president set a goal to increase the nation's R&D, public and private, from 2.7% GDP, where it's been for a long time, to at least 3.3% GDP. Many presidents have suggested 3% of GDP. We never can get there, so we believe it's time to up the ante. Next, improve the R&D budget process, which doesn't work very well. That's not a secret. We're suggesting that the president submit and Congress consider a rolling 5-year R&D plan for all the agencies. It should come out with every budget request, and it should be part of the discussion between the White House and Congress. We propose a 2-year budget cycle. That's not new. Many organizations have done that. Just better planning and better spending of the taxpayers' money. We propose, we think new probably, a capital budget for R&D. With the argument that R&D really should be counted as an investment rather than operating expenses. We propose reducing burdensome regulations that offer little benefit, sometimes none, and reform policies that are barriers to getting discoveries to market. It's really important to get the benefits of the investment and research in universities and national labs to the American people. We're proposing growing America's science and engineering workforce, better educate America's youth, every county and every state, and attract the best talent from across the globe. Next slide talks a little bit more about education, and we add some new recommendations here. First, in general, to improve education and the workforce in this country, transform public pre-K-12 education, implement the recommendations of the 2005-2010 National Academies reports, Rising Above the Gathering Storm. And all of you know, Norm Augustine chaired the study group that issued that report, that very influential report, and certainly could answer any questions about what's in there when we come to the question session. Next, strengthen the government-university industry partnership. We really don't have such a partnership in this country. We talk about it all the time, and we have bits and pieces of cooperation across these sectors, but we need a stronger partnership. Other countries have it, and we don't. Universities should share best practices. Universities and industry companies should share best practices on cost containment, capital planning, and enhanced cooperation with industry. State universities should restore funding for their public colleges and universities to at least their pre-2008 levels, and Congress should repeal the tax on endowment earnings of many private universities and colleges. All that does is lead to increased tuition and reduced quality of education of the students. The federal government really does need to revise the IRS guidance and regulations, clarify them, but also revise them. Try to encourage stronger university industry collaboration. We may need a change in the law to get that done. So let me stop. Let me just show one. I'm not going to show one more figure, but let me just comment on the funding recommendation again. What we noticed in our first report when we looked at the data was that the federal government had been growing its investment in basic research in real terms and after inflation by over 4% between around 1995 and between 1975 or so and 1993 or so, roughly a 20-year period. And those were not easy times. Those were times of high inflation, oil embargoes, you remember, gas lines, Cold War still going on. And yet, somehow, the U.S. federal government had determined that basic research was a sufficiently high priority that it really ought to grow relative to pretty much everything else. If we had continued on that path, we would have had basic research, federal basic research funded at 0.3% of GDP already, rather than where it continues to be 0.2%, essentially flat. So our recommendation is really get back on track. Let's start a sustainable growth path, a modest sustainable growth path of at least 4% above inflation every year. And as quickly as possible, recover from what we've lost from over 20 years of failure to invest in basic research, which really is the front end of the whole innovation process. So with that, let me just stop and ask Norm for any final comment he wants to make before we take your questions.
Well, thanks, Neil. I would just add that, as mentioned at the outset, we're not going to match China in terms of the number of scientists we have, the number of engineers, the number of soldiers. The only way America is going to be highly competitive on the world scene is by being more creative, by producing great new knowledge, by being more innovative, by applying the knowledge that's developed. That's going to have to be the margin of success for our country in the years ahead. And with that final thought, let me turn back to Brendan.
Well, thank you very much, Neil and Norm. I know that 15 minutes really isn't enough to do justice to your report, but I think you've made the major issues very clear. We're now going to turn to question and answers. We already have a few questions in, and so they'll be appearing on the screen for your consideration.
Neil, do you want to take that one? If you could.
I will. Yeah, I'm sorry. I lost it until just now, and I see it on my screen. Thank you for posting it, and thank you, Jack, for asking the question. So the question, I guess everybody sees, the question has to do with the COVID projects, which really are quite promising, model for other efforts. And I think I'll just say that while COVID is, of course, nothing positive about it, but it does create a pandemic moment, if you like, rather like a Sputnik moment. Some people have drawn the analogy. It's an opportunity to have a conversation with policymakers and the American people about the importance of science, and how we handle that discussion, how we handle that dialogue with the American public will, I think, allow us to do the things that Norm and I are talking about today, or not. So it is a significant challenge. So I think, in Jack's question, the question is it a model for other efforts? It's an opportunity to have the discussion. I mean, it probably is a kind of model, but I would say, we didn't sufficiently anticipate COVID ahead of time, so that we could have made much more progress and ended up saving many more lives. There will be future crises. Some of them will be pandemics. They could be natural disasters. They could be results of bad behavior on the part of individuals or organizations. We've got to be ready for them. And so the model needs to be warning us that we need to plan for these things, even with the uncertainty of not quite knowing what they are. When I was science advisor, of course, the thing you expect is the asteroid is coming. So suddenly the science advisor is called upon to save the world. Well, that didn't happen, and we don't want the asteroid to come. This is an opportunity. Norm?
Yeah, I would just add that in the way of a model, there are arguments now being made in high places that we should build walls around basic research. We should totally protect basic research, make it a national project. And I think that COVID has certainly pointed out that no nation has all the knowledge of basic research, nor is it likely to in the future. And that the value of cooperation is just enormous. And I was just struck this morning that a combined U.S.-European project that I think Germany and the U.S. and production is now in Belgium, and the vaccines are coming to the United States. The research is really a global endeavor, and I hope that we can avoid trying to build walls around it.
Norm, why don't you take this question on what the greatest obstacle is to implementing our recommendations?
Okay, I don't see that on my screen, but I will assume you didn't just make that up to be tough for me here.
No.
I think let me address that in two parts. One part would be the K through 12 education part, that the United States is simply not competitive. And I think the biggest obstacle there is that our K through 12 education is run by 14,000 independent, underlined, school districts. And if we try to repair them one at a time, it's going to take a long time. And yet there's an important belief in this country, well-founded, I guess, that the federal government shouldn't get very involved in public education. And so that's going to be a challenge that will have to be dealt with. When it comes to the funding, the greatest challenge that I think Neil and I would see in our group is the disappearance of discretionary funds in the federal budget. The federal budget has those things that are called non-discretionaries that are under current law that you just have to do. And those, by and large, consist of the social programs, Medicare, Medicaid, and so on. They also include things like paying the interest on the national debt. But if you project revenues forward based on current law, and you project discretionaries ahead, non-discretionaries like Medicare, the curves cross in 2042, not that far away, meaning there will be no money for research, for education, for infrastructure, for defense. And the only solutions to that really are cut discretionary funds, which are non-discretionaries, which the Congress is going to like, nor the public, greatly raise taxes, which nobody's going to like, or borrow more money, which will simply increase the interest on the debt. And much of that borrowing will come from abroad. All very tough solutions. And I think the lesson there is the quicker we act, the more flexibility we're going to have. Because if we wait another decade, there'll be very little flexibility to solve these problems.
We've got a question coming up about our recommendations that are aimed at attracting the best STEM talent from across the globe and how this applies to foreign-born STEM students. I just make a personal comment here. I mean, this xenophobic rhetoric and unfortunate policies have been put in place on immigration. I can't imagine doing things that are worse for the United States future. They're inconsistent with the values of the country and really have to stop. I'm really talking about the xenophobic comments. The policies are more complicated. They just need to be thoughtful policies based on evidence. And so that presumably those will be dealt with the universities working with the federal government in the coming days and weeks. One thing that the White House, OSTP, has tried to do through the National Science Technology Council, Kelvin Drogemeyer, is to address this issue of what needs to be done, if anything, but what needs to be done to protect the integrity of America's research. And I think that I'm only speaking for myself. I think that's in part to keep from the Congress passing some of these crazy bills that would be extraordinarily damaging to the United States, to just essentially shut the doors and turn out the lights, assuming that all the great discoveries are going to be made here by us, and we don't need anybody coming in. I mean, this country, our science and technology enterprise, our economy is so heavily dependent on talent coming from abroad. That's why we've made our recommendations. So I think progress can be made by continuing what's been started in some of the discussions by the federal government, but the universities really need to weigh in here because we just simply can't afford to cut ourselves off from the rest of the world, particularly attracting, encouraging young people to come here and study and raise their families and establish their careers. Many of them create jobs, grow the economy, contribute to American society. That has to continue. That's what this country is all about. Norm, you want to add anything?
Well, just briefly, that I think one can build a very strong argument that America's science and technology enterprise would not function today were it not for foreign-born individuals who came here, received their higher education here, and decided to stay here, raise families, and contribute to the American dream. And if one visits most any university in this country, or visits most any high-tech company, or visits a hospital, one will find a huge body of immigrants who came here and became citizens and contributed. And without that, our system, as I say, I think would barely function today.
We've got a question that that I think you can see on the screen. Director of National Intelligence. I'll let you read the statement. People's Republic of China pose the greatest threat to America today. So I guess the question is, do we share this point of view? Norm?
Well, one of the challenges of our study has been that China, of course, is making enormous progress economically and become a greater factor in the world. At the same time, China has chosen not to follow many of the rules that other countries have chosen to follow, most other countries. And indeed, they plant spies among the students that they send here. But the solution to that, as we do with domestic spies, is we ferret them out and treat them under the law. It's not to deny any specific group from having their some of their youth educated at American universities. So I share the concern that China could become a significant threat in the future. But I think that if we wall ourselves off from our allies and even from China, in some respects, for example, I would hope we could continue commerce, that we could continue sharing students. I think those things will be helpful to try and produce a good outcome to this change. But my first trip to China was in 1978, and I rarely saw an automobile. People used to go up to my guide and recognize me as not belonging there and say that they'd heard that I was from America, and that was very wealthy, and they wanted to know how many bicycles I owned. And you contrast that with today, and you have to be impressed.
How many bicycles did you own?
I actually had one at the time.
Okay.
Still do.
So let me agree. I certainly agree that the China's government is a major threat, I guess, at least challenge. This particular comment seems to have some political aspect to it, so I wouldn't agree with the whole statement as it is made. And our report does not address. Our report is not anti-China. Our report is about pointing out where China is and what it has accomplished, and that if the United States is to compete with China in the world, and we focus on the economy, not the national security side, then we have to do the following things. That's the way in which we address China. But we also point out that there have been bad actors. There have been individuals who behaved inappropriately. Frankly, they were mainly in small companies, not in universities, but that's a personal comment. So yes, the Chinese government is distinct from the Chinese people, in my view, rather like our government does not represent, in statements like this one, the views of all the American people. So last thing I would say is that to identify, to characterize people because of where they came from, for example, some of our students studying in this country, to characterize those individual people as threats because they are Chinese origin is simply inconsistent with American values. So transparency, diplomacy, while exercising prudent national security policies and behaviors, sure, that's complicated. I mean, Norm knows about that. He was in the Pentagon. I have not had that experience, but I understand it's complex. But you have to do it, and you don't do it by closing the doors and refusing to talk. So another one. Let's see. Somebody really likes the industry partnership question. Yeah, I know that's not a question, but we appreciate any comments, positive or negative, about our report. So in any other, Brendan, so are there any other things we should take on, or have we run out of time? Oh, there is one more question I see that I should take up. Comes from Moshe Vardi, and it asks me, I guess, because we're colleagues, and so he's going to stick me with this. Could I elaborate on what a stronger university industry partnership looks like? I think I don't have the experience to answer this with any kind of examples that I personally have participated in. But the fact that it is difficult for universities like mine and others to have in the laboratory, working shoulder to shoulder, students, postdocs, faculty members, engineers from companies, the fact that that's as difficult as it is without building a building off in some other part of the city or just taking a chance on the IRS regulations, that's the problem. So yes, the policies are complicated, and we're saying they need to be looked at carefully, just to try to remove as many of those barriers as possible. Norm, you have experience.
Well, it's an important question because it's our universities, by and large, not industry, that's creating the new knowledge that products and services are based on. But it's industry, not our universities, that are going to apply those things and make them useful to the public. And if we don't tighten that bond, we will tend to lose this race to be competitive. How do you tighten the bond? I think one thing is you make it a lot easier for people to move back and forth between highly qualified people, let me emphasize, back and forth between industry and the universities, and I would add government to that list. That's the best way of transferring technology I've found, is to transfer people, move people around. And that there are so many other things that come to mind, letting industry find ways to invest in university research without having to pay taxes on the money that's being invested and so forth. But the opportunities are there for much closer cooperation than we have today. And in that regard, I might also add that professors at many universities are penalized and seeking tenure because they spent part of their careers out starting companies. And that strikes me that within limits, that should be a positive, not a negative. And that's changing at many universities, fortunately.
So as the question comes up about K-12 education, and Norm's really followed this very carefully. Let me just say that our report does not, we do not intend to have treated K-12 education as an afterthought. And I know the question doesn't suggest that, but the reason so much of our report is pointed to the federal government is that we are focused on things that the federal government can do. That's probably our number one circle of shell of the onion, if you like. And then we try to talk about things, prudent things that can be done by state governments and others. So, yeah, I mean, my view would be it's hard to think of anything more important than reforming K-12, but Norm is focused on ways to do that. And I mentioned the Gathering Storm report earlier. Norm, you want to comment on K-12 ed and why it's the most important area, or if it isn't, what's your view?
Just briefly, this is one of these things that it's a chain and you have to repair every link, but I think you could clearly argue that it's the most critical link at this point in this country. One of the big problems is our teachers, and particularly in middle school, are not qualified to teach math and science by and large. The majority of teachers a student will have in middle school have a teacher for math and science, the physical sciences, that don't have a degree or even a certificate in the field. And we have to solve that. And given that, the students tend to not be very interested. It doesn't seem very exciting to them to study math and science. And we lose a huge part of our talent base there. We also lose a good part of our talent base because fathers tell their 8-year-old daughters that girls don't do math. Whereas the facts are that girls do math at least as well as males at that point, but they drop out. And so we lose half of the population in terms of contributing to math and science. That's an overstatement, but we lose a major part of the population. So I think the idea that the public takes for granted the benefits of science and technology. Very few people, the public, associate their cell phone with basic research on quantum science, for example, or the other things that get involved. And that's one of the things that scientists could do is a better job of, as engineers as well, relating what they do to better people's lives. Much of what they do is taken for granted.
And I think that, earlier we talked about the pandemic moment. It's an opportunity to talk with American people about, and I mean that in the sense of dialogue with American people about what science can do. Of course, it's science and engineering. The scientists, by and large, are not the ones who deliver, who transform, who transfer the knowledge to the companies and to government for the benefit of the American people. But the other part of this question is, how does the public support the investment if they have no idea how the innovations work? As Norm pointed out, science, by and large, we have the goodwill of the public. Numbers maybe are not as high as we would like, but boy, they're about as high as you get on anything else, including who do you trust the most, scientists or reporters or members of Congress? Or, we're, in terms of trust, we're very close to the military, which is always number one, and right up there with physicians, medical doctors. So we do need to be careful not to lose that level of support. And then how can we do better? I think the public support for science is largely because, in agreement with Norm, because they associate it with health and medicine, with going to the doctor and getting taken care of, as opposed to the cell phone or other things that are very important. So making that link is a challenge. And I think when we talk about pandemic and how science has contributed, which we hope it will, certainly promising, to getting rid of this awful scourge on society, we need to talk about not just the vaccines, even though that's going to be front and center, and that's what people are going to be thinking about, but all the other ways in which science has contributed to technology, knowledge and technologies that have helped address this pandemic. But then you can broaden the discussion immediately to health more broadly and to other things that are important in people's lives. Last thing I would say is we really need more efforts locally. We really need for people to understand how science impacts their lives in a positive way where they live, in their city, in their rural community, in their county, their state, different parts of states across the country that are sparsely populated and whose politics can be quite different from that of many of the rest of us. Somehow we got to get that message out. And so you got members all over the country and in companies and in universities and in other places where engineering shines brightly, and getting in touch with those local populations, those local communities. We're all in a better position to know how to do that where we live, as opposed to maybe how the federal government or how our science societies are going to do that in some one or another parts of the country. So, getting some more attention to where people live and work and raise their kids, that would be an important thing that I would say we have not done very well at in the past. So, Norm, you want to take you're an IEEE Lifetime Fellow. So what should you and your colleagues do?
Well, the IEEE has actually been one of the leaders in conveying this message to the Congress for many years. And I've had the good fortune of being part of that on occasion. Uh, the it always amazes me that if you add together the number of people who are jobs depend on electrical engineering and the other forms of engineering that are members of the IEEE, the AIAA, or what have you, it's a huge number of people. And I can remember working one time with the IEEE when it was a presidential election, and we put together a list of questions about science and engineering, and they were not hostile questions, and sent them to the candidates and asked if they would not even give a speech or anything, but have somebody, their staff, write down an answer to each of the questions, or just a brief answer. And one of the candidates declined to do it. The other one we never heard back from. Now, if the American Medical Association or the American Bar Association or the likes were to send a questionnaire to the members or invite them to their annual meeting, you could bet they'd show up and answer the questions or try to answer the questions. And somehow the engineering community is fragmented. And my belief is that if the IEEE joins even more strongly than today with the American Chemical Society, the civil engineers, and so on, that their voice would be much louder. It could be heard, and that science engineers, and I'm one of them, tend to be more inward-looking and think that their contributions speak for themselves, and unfortunately, they don't. And just quickly, I think of a story Dan Golden told me when he was administrator of NASA, that he had been conducting a town meeting, and one of the people in the audience said that Dan was always arguing for all this money to have to make satellites and stuff. For example, weather satellites. And the person in the audience said, "Why do we need money for weather satellites? We have the Weather Channel." And the person was serious. The person didn't relate weather satellites to getting the news and the weather of the evening. And that's an extreme case, but ask somebody how their cell phone works and see what kind of an answer you get and where it came from. Neil, you referred to this. I'm always struck, being an engineer, when they show on TV that each evening the millions of bottles of vaccines pouring through these robotic machines. I'm struck not only by the miracle inside the bottle, but those machines that are turning out bottles by the millions to pretty high specs. And if it hadn't been for robotics, we wouldn't have those machines. We'd have batches of chemicals at chemical companies, not vaccines to be injected in your arm. So that's kind of a long answer, but I think that that we have lots of opportunities as a society to convey this message.
Well, amen to what Norm said, and I particularly have tried to focus on this issue of organizations like this great one working together, developing a common message and stepping forward. I mean, science and engineering are less separated on the university campuses now than in past years. Scientists are doing engineering. In some cases, engineers are doing science. Many of them all working across disciplines in the same laboratory in this transdisciplinary mode of research. So if the professional societies could more reflect that kind of integration and cooperation, maybe the message would be heard finally, so that the politicians would pay attention when we ask them questions. Maybe they would think that even politically, it was important for them to pay more attention to science, engineering, mathematics, and technology. Thank you so much.
All right, everyone. Unfortunately, we are out of time. If we were not able to get to your question today, you can defer to the full report, which the link to access it has been provided below. We will also forward your questions to Neil and Norm and have them get back to them when they are able to. This concludes our special IEEE USA live stream presentation. Thank you so much, Neil and Norm, for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And thank you everyone for tuning in and for your great questions for our presenters. Check back daily on our social media for future live stream updates, and we hope you all have a great rest of your day.